It's Wizards versus Lesbians, a podcast for your ears. Hello and welcome to Wizards versus Lesbians. My name is Isaac.
I'm Alexis.
And today we are discussing He Who Drowned the World by Shelley Parker Chan.
The sequel to She Who Became the Sun.
Yes, indeed. It's been a moment since we recorded, although because of our buffer, you will have experienced no break in our seamless content delivery. So we may take a moment to get up to speed here, but I seem to remember the first thing that we ask is whether Alexis wants to recap the plot or whether I do. So
why don't you?
Okay. So the last we left our hero, actually, you know, it's difficult. It's difficult to give the plot summary of this book without spoiling the last volume.
Yeah, I feel like though, if you're listening to this one, having not read the first one, now that we've explained to you that this is a sequel, I feel like, you know, you've been appropriately spoiler warned. So.
Yes. So our hero, having just murdered a small child and stolen his mandate of heaven, now has to make good her conquest of the empire. Our hero is Zhu, who is going to be the first emperor of the Ming dynasty. That's not a spoiler either, because that's part of the historical record.
Right. We know this because Zhu Yuanzhang indeed became the first emperor of the Ming dynasty.
Spoilers for ancient Chinese historical events. So there is that. But she has to work her way through a bunch of different contenders for the throne in order to do this, all of whom are people suffering from some kind of gender problem.
Yes.
And so she must... and she's, by the way, disguised as a man / possibly a man, depending on how you want to read the text at this point.
She's definitely some kind of genderqueer.
Yes.
But she still uses she pronouns when she's narrating to herself.
Indeed, indeed.
Not that this would actually matter in Chinese, because it would all be ta.
Right. But so she has to make her way through the furious eunuch Ouyang and the devious homosexual who is not actually gay, Wang Baoxiang, and the salts baroness lady. What's her face? What's her name again?
Madame Zhang. Yes,
Madame Zhang, who is working her way up to empresshood via a series of increasingly competent husbands. She must overcome all of these people in order to make it to the throne, and that is the plot of the book.
Yes. And so, will she make it? Yes, we know this because it is on Wikipedia. What will she have to sacrifice to get there? And what will happen to these other viewpoint characters? That's the stakes that we're talking about.
Yes, indeed. Even though the first book was, I think, reasonably Wizards versus Lesbians, the most romantic relationship in this book is a BDSM relationship between a trans man and a eunuch. So I'm not entirely sure if we're still really in lesbian territory, but wizards certainly abound.
Wizards abound, and I mean, we still have one of the things that is at stake. One of the things that Drew may or may not have to sacrifice to get what she wants is her relationship with Ma Xiaoying, her wife.
Indeed.
Which, again, we know that they're going to be married by the end because Empress Ma is actually part of the historical record. Though by the time we get to this book, Shelley Parker Chan has already been playing fast and loose with the actual historical record, and is only going to go more so over the course of this novel. But still, whether or not they will have any relationship to speak of other than purely political by the end is still at stake. And so I think that we're still, there are still lesbians here to get emotionally invested in if that is what you like. And if you're listening to this podcast, it's probably a thing that you like.
That is true, but I must stress that the major theme of this book is masculinity.
Yes. But in a really queer way.
Yes, exactly. It's not as though this is a avenue of inquiry completely foreign to lesbians.
So there are wizards, there are lesbians. Do they fight? Oh, yes. Everybody is fighting everybody in this book.
Oh my God.
This is what happens when a dynasty falls.
So why should you read this book?
It's really well written. It's really well paced. It's just, real good, I thought. It's got a lot of interesting things to say about gender and identity and, the parts of yourself that you are willing to compromise or trade off in, and what that might gain you and what that might cost. Also, does a lot of, historically extremely inaccurate but really interesting things with the historical record. And thus, I would say it is in dialogue with the long tradition of Chinese historical romances.
Exactly. I couldn't have said it better myself. I really enjoyed reading this. I think that it's the longest book that we've done where I had no complaints about it being the longest book that we've done.
Yeah, if anything, I remember going, is this going, this is the rare book where I'm like, is this going to wrap up in time?
Yeah.
And then it does.
It is absolutely an epic. I think that it definitely sort of reaches for grand tragedy and kind of hits it and kind of doesn't, but we'll get more into that later. But the mere fact that it can aspire to that, believably, is saying a lot.
Honestly, this is doing the gritty, historically accurate, but with magic and weirdness thing that, A Song of Ice and Fire claims to do, but doesn't really. So
yes, this is
if you
much better than 99% of high fantasy.
Right, but the thing is that this is very much also in the tradition of the grand Western high fantasy epic where you get sort of ever expanding viewpoint characters, and the stakes just keep getting bigger and bigger as you add more viewpoint characters. But this one actually pulls it off, partly by keeping this, and doesn't do the thing that a lot of these books do, which is turn into a 10-book series.
Yes, or, Satan doesn't appear, or we're not
right.
trying to save the world from eternal darkness. We're only saving the world from eternal darkness metaphorically, not literally.
And it doesn't. It just turns out that this isn't all just a thinly veiled way for the author to get really into Ayn Rand.
Yeah. So, if you are hungry for that kind of book, but have been disappointed by what's been on offer, I think that you could do far worse than reading both this book. And I think this one might edge out its predecessor a little bit in terms of quality, even. Now, why shouldn't you read this book?
Well, it's kind of there's some places where it's a really grim slog, and not in a way that was boring. The author does do the rare thing of making depression be very realistic and grim, but also not deeply boring. But boy, the depressing parts are real depressing.
Yeah, both in terms of what's going on in the characters' heads and horrible atrocities are occurring at every turn. So, it's certainly not for the faint of heart. We'll be getting into a laundry list of content warnings in a second.
I guess if you are the sort of person who gets really upset with somebody playing around with history, then I guess this book will upset you even more than its predecessor did.
Yes, I would say that my two major complaints about the book are that it is not subtle. It's not. I mean, that's not a failing. It's not setting out to be subtle. But you may the 20th time that it states the theme, you may start to roll your eyes a little bit. And the other one is that I don't like the ending. But your mileage may vary on that.
I had mixed feelings about the ending, but it did not quite, stick its landing, I think.
It's a very, very, very long journey to not stick its landing. But then again, I can't think of it like an epic like this that fully manages it. So, And
I will say that it does a thing that generally does annoy me, which is that it is a story about war, and the stakes are personal, and that is fine, except that it's a story about war where everything that matters is, has to do with what the commander of the army, the
yeah.
generals are doing personally to each other, which, you know, it's very much using war as a metaphor, and it is not really an effective story about war. And the thing is that the first book I think was a little bit better about that. And so I was a little disappointed to see this one become much more about interpersonal drama instead of continuing to widen its scope.
It does. I mean, it does make sense for our main character, because Ju did start as a foot soldier, you know, and worked his way up. But by the time we get to this book, we have no more point of view characters who are not heads of armies, essentially.
Right. And, you know, I thought that the previous book did a very good job of building and of like slowly broadening its scope until you are thinking, you know, you start out thinking about what is going to happen to this one small person. And by the end, you are both concerned about what's going to happen to this one small person, but also invested in what are these armies going to do to each other. And this one really does not make the army thing, you know, does not really pull off making you care about the armies, which again puts it very much in, you know, the long tradition of the Chinese historical romance. So I can't complain too much about it.
That was exactly what I was going to say. Yes. It's like, this is, you know, Chinese historical romance, most historical romances, like, no, not just Chinese, you know, romance of the Three Kingdoms on to, you know, any sort of war epic from the Western world. And yeah, you know, it makes a choice and it goes with it. And you know, you could interpret it as just sort of the deadening of the moral sort of attention of the book goes part and parcel with the deadening of the moral attention of the main characters, because by this time, absolutely everybody is an irredeemable monster except for Ma.
Yes.
So, you know.
Yes. And I will say that this book, most of the ways in which this book sidesteps history are interesting. Occasionally this book sidesteps history in a way that is less interesting or seems to be dodging a thorny question. But that can wait till the grumpy zone. That's not a major issue. Okay, so I think content warnings, because boy, do they abound.
Right. So torture, like gruesome methods of execution, the
self-harm.
Self-harm, lots of self-harm.
Tons of suicidal ideation.
Rape, anywhere from like coercive to outright forced to using sex in a manipulative way and sex with a minor in a manipulative way. Let's see here. I mean, that's sort of the Mount Rushmore of content warnings. Your sort of murder, rape, torture, and assault. But and, you know, there's some misgendering, there's some being outed as being transgender or as cross-dressing, however you want to interpret it. There's outright, like, vile misogyny.
And homophobia.
And homophobia, yes.
And boy, some gays get buried.
And bashed.
And aside from all of the, you know, rape, there's also a lot of really unpleasant sex that people don't want to have, but are knowingly consenting to because it gets them something that they want, but often in ways that still feel like a violation, even though like this person completely opted in.
Yes, there's certainly a lot of there's body horror in the form of Lady Zhang's bound feet, and a general preoccupation with sort of bodily mutilation and being othered because of disability.
Yep.
Really, like there's you know, you name it, this book has it.
I wouldn't go that far, but you know, this is definitely on the more brutal side of the books that we have read.
Indeed. I found it all pretty well handled.
I agree. I thought that by and large it was sort of unflinching, but without feeling voyeuristic. I apologize for all the noises. The cat has gone insane.
that is perfectly reasonable. Some things cannot be avoided. Well, having laid all of that out, let's discuss this sucker.
Yeah.
Onto the spoiler zone we go.
All right.
Spoiler zone. Spoiler zone. All right. So, Jesus H. Christ.
I don't know what has gotten into him.
Yep. So it's difficult to know where to begin. Would you like to is there anything that you particularly want to discuss, or shall I just pick a random point and proceed?
Well, I think my getting into the nitty gritty of the ways that this sidesteps some of the issues of the Ming Dynasty should wait. So actually, one of the interesting takeaways I found about this book, because this book definitely has themes, oh, yeah. And the first book, the themes were, the theme was ambition, right?
Yes.
Because everything, the thing that defines this book is people have goals and they are ruthlessly working towards them, no matter the personal cost and the cost to others. And this one, they're continuing to do that. But I would say that the big theme of this book is loss and grief, and how do you deal with those trade-offs that you've made without, especially before you have even reached your goal.
Indeed. That's definitely part of it. The other part is this book delves further into why you are so ambitious and what the difference is between a good man who seeks power and a bad man who seeks power. And appears to come to the conclusion that bad people are better at it.
Right.
And also the other big theme is masculinities, as I mentioned, and so we have so many princes here. Like there's princes as far as the eye can see, many of whom die off early, but we've got Wang, and we've got Ouyang, and we've got Zhang, and we've got Zhu, and two princes kneel before you, they're vying for the throne. Actually, a bunch more princes just showed up, they're vying for the throne. They all seem to be having problems with their masculinity. This one seems to be a woman, she's vying for the throne.
Yes.
All of them are in some way unmanned.
Yes.
It turns out that Zhu is the best at being a man out of all of them, despite the fact that she's a woman. But
yes, whatever she is complicated, but she is the best at being a man, and possibly I think she's also the only one who really handles being unmanned and is just willing to go, well, that was unpleasant, and keep going.
Yes, it's sort of the shame and resentment about being treated as less than. Is both the source of the ambition of so many of the major players for power here, but also their inability to get over that is their downfall, because it destroys them from the inside, even as they gain power. Whereas Zhu, despite, losing her best bro and therefore actually feeling sad for the first time.
Basically in her life.
Yeah. Is still not like a consumed bonfire of self-pity and revenge and anger the way that Ouyang and Wang Baoxiang and Madame Zhang are.
Yes.
Although Madame Zhang is a slightly different story, but
she is. Because she is actually the other person who's really good at seeking power. It's just when she gets it, she's not really sure how to handle it because she's not able emotionally and socially to seize power in her own name. And the fact that her power is always contingent on a man means that she can never be secure in it in the way that Zhu eventually will be.
Exactly. Yes.
But Madame Zhang is the other person who, despite suffering sort of a crushing emotional blow, kind of for the first time in her life, is also able to roll with it.
This is true. But she is able to roll with everything partially because she has become so disassociated, which is partially she's been trained from an early age to ignore bodily pain because she's had her feet mutilated as a teenager. But she can once she wants power, but like once she has it, society means that she can't, actually be secure in it. But also she's incapable of enjoying it because she's incapable of enjoying anything. Because she's a floating head, basically.
Yeah.
And this is also true of Wang Baoxiang, who, by the time he turns himself into the thing that he needs to be in order to take power, he can't even enjoy all of the artsy fartsy aesthetics and like fancy clothes and stuff that was why he was other in the first place.
Right. There's all the things that, that brought him genuine joy, and relationships that brought him genuine joy. And once he gets power, he still has his personal aesthetic, but instead of it being a thing that, makes him happy, it is a thing that he uses to make other people unhappy. And because that is how he feels powerful, is that now he can do the things he was not allowed to do, like swish, and wear pretty outfits. And nobody can do anything about it because he's the emperor now, however briefly. And part of this, of course, is that one of the characters who was such a focal point in, though not a really viewpoint character in the first book, his loss is what's completely driving both Wang Baoxiang and Ouyang.
Yes, he was the first prince that we lost, and his masculinity problem was that he, despite being like the ideal of Mongol manhood, was gay, and in love with Ouyang, the eunuch.
To be fair, I think he seemed kind of bi, honestly. I mean, he was hitting on his best friend, the eunuch, by saying how womanly he was. But really the only thing that made Essen, not the model of Mongol manhood. The thing is, Essen always was the model of Mongol manhood. He just got backstabbed and died.
No, I have to push back against that. I think that like much is made in this book by both Ouyang and Wang Baoxiang of Issun's propensity for dudes. I don't think that he was like.
No, but I don't think it's presented as a flaw in the same way that the whatever prince. I can't remember his number.
The third prince.
The third prince, like the third prince, his gayness is a fatal flaw because he's not comfortable in it, and this is and this is like desires that he's ashamed of. But Issun is just he's not cruel. Like he doesn't have any of the flaws that come with other people's masculinity. He's not cruel particularly. Like he's really awkward with his extremely effeminate brother, but he still cares about him and is trying to understand him. He's not, his masculinity isn't threatened by having his best friend be a eunuch. And he excels in all of the things. It's just, again, his fatal flaw is that he's a nice guy in a world where that's not going to work out for you.
No, I think you're right there. I think that like his fatal flaw, I mean, in the most brute of terms, is trusting Ouyang.
Right. And Wang Baoxiang.
And Wang Baoxiang, but like he's sort of like, we needed a decent man for all of this to work, because we needed like a decent man for all of these people like who fail to be men and then fail to be decent as a result of failing to be men, to take out their resentment on. Like, yes. It needs to be demonstrated that like, okay, this system worked for this one guy in much the same way that it presumably worked for his father before him, but
his father was an asshole.
Yes. But it's like, it doesn't matter if you get a good man in charge, because the system is still going to create these massive inequities, resentments, and thus the sort of consuming resentment and ambition that manifests itself as the mandate of heaven in this text.
Right.
This is echoed in Madame Zhang's lover, who betrayed his brother, but still has some scruples, so he's too nice for this world.
And, I mean, we have one other good guy, and in this book, he's the one who gets sacrificed, and he goes in much more willingly. He doesn't get backstabbed; he sacrifices himself willingly. But also, he's a model of a different kind of manhood. He's not a model of Mongol princedom.
Yes, indeed. No, this book isn't like the token good man sort of misinterest book. This book is like just fascinated with men, really, and with
and I would say also with masculinity, because again, and I mean also there is a couple interesting explorations of femininity, but it is mostly about exploring masculinity, but it's not necessarily men, because Drew seems to me to be transmasc in some way, but I wouldn't necessarily call her a man. Partly, and I think that there is an interesting statement that this book is making that basically posits that, trans men can be better men because their masculinity is less fragile, which I'm not sure I agree with, but I think is an interesting statement to make.
Yeah, no, that is certainly mooted by this book, I think. Can be is a very broad thing to say. For me, the whole but the thing is that Jude it's not only that Jude can, have a better relationship with her masculinity because she was born female, but she also really wants to help the other men to become more comfortable with their masculinity.
She does. Which is a fascinating thing. I was really her desire to bond with Ouyang and be like, look, we are both, men who are not able to be men, but who are, still in that social slot. And she's, that it's going to end in disaster, but she's so invested in it that I personally was like, even though I knew it was going to end in disaster, I was still kind of disappointed when it did.
So I really enjoyed this book, but the one part of it that made me hoot and holler and exclaim out loud while I was listening to it was the whole section where Ouyang and Ju are becoming the weirdest, bromance friends that you've ever seen.
Right. It's like a bromance founded on this masochism, BDSM, completely, thing between a eunuch and a asexual non-binary lesbian.
She's not asexual.
Drew? She seems pretty asexual. She's pretty clear that she has no particular interest in having sex. She enjoys, because even with, the only people that she has any interest in at all are women. Even then, she's pretty clear, at least in the first book makes it pretty clear that, she's mostly doing this to make Ma Xiaoying happy.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I think that we called her Stone at that point.
That's fair. But
it's really funny to me. Speaking of unsubtlety, in the episode where we talked about the last book in the series, I was like, haha, fisting, funny. But but then she gets her hand cut off. I hadn't made that connection. That's why the fisting scene is in there, because it's made much more explicit now here because, there's all this sort of steamy talk about how when Ouyang put his sword in her, it made her the person that she was.
Right.
She may be asexual, but her relationship with Ouyang is erotic.
Oh, yes, but I think she's definitely on the ace spectrum, but there's definitely ace spectrum people who get up to way kinkier stuff as a result. So,
absolutely,
and she's definitely one of those.
Yes, but it's okay. So in fact, Ouyang penetrated and castrated her on their first meeting.
Yes,
and so when they are coming back together here, and she is repaying this pain to him in a way that is saving his life. It's by far the weirdest thing in this book and the most fascinating thing in this book.
It really works, I thought.
Oh God, yes. No, I loved it.
It's it's one of those, and again, this is the sort of thing that I feel like a lot of these sort of gritty fantasy epics try to do weird sex stuff, and or weird like sublimated sex stuff, and don't pull it off. But this one really pulls it off.
So to speak. Yes. Of course, the whole thing falls apart when Oh-young discovers that she's female, and
because his masculinity
and his massive internalized misogyny, because of his fear of being perceived as a woman, is enough to override any possible positive emotions he might have toward her.
Right. Well, and I mean, it's both his fear of being seen as a woman, but also in this case that he's had this relationship where that's definitely a somewhat submissive one, and with a woman, like, you can't get more unmanned than that from his perspective without getting castrated a second time. And so, he flips out and flees. And the thing is, I love, obviously that was coming. Obviously that's exactly how it was going to end. And I love that Drew is just like, but we could have been bros. We were getting somewhere.
Drew is kind of a she, her, himbo, except for all the murdering. This is very advanced. Because
she has such a good sense of, like, such a finely honed sense of people's gender anxieties and how to, like, work with them. But that one, she's just, at this point, she's so caught up in her vision that she's just not capable of realizing that one thing.
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, but the thing is that the book is extremely good at letting you see what Ju sees in him.
Right.
Because, like, our experience with him, this guy is like, he's probably a sociopath. He's murdered or caused to be murdered, like, innumerable people. He's cruel. He doesn't care about the consequences of his actions. But when he is subjected to Ju's friendliness and, like, the possibly, definitely the first person in his life since Isun who has been, in any way nice to him. Mm-hmm. You see him sort of devolve into this sort of like Sam the Eagle, like ruffled Muppet, where he's just like, but he's like clearly, kind of sensitive and, sort of like, rubbing his feet together.
Yeah, I think
you can see the sort of the shape of a human being in there briefly before that door closes again.
Right. And I mean, and part of that is because, and this is where Drew's finely honed gender, senses works out for her, is that she's able to both, give him an outlet for his self-loathing, but also make him feel, but still make him feel like he's being seen as a man. And this is because she has such an expansive view of masculinity, because she's able to see herself as masculine, and that she's able to sort of give that to him, and that he's getting, he's basically she's the only person who meets his emotional needs in any way in this entire duology.
Yes, that's exactly right. Isun is incapable of, because Isun is a male who's confident in his masculinity, is completely incapable of understanding where
Young is coming from.
Right. Despite loving him. So
yeah, that was it. Real weird, real well handled.
Yeah, I very much loved it. Let's quickly turn our attention to the prince that we haven't spent a lot of time talking about so far. Mr. the homosexual, they call me, Wang Baoxiang.
Yes.
The homosexual, they call him, it's all the same to he. That specter they projected, he will now pretend to be, when their neurosis is what passes for normality. It's okay with him if he's queer when their tone deafness is called love music. He won't disabuse them, he'll go down on their children.
Who, you know, and he was such a... I really enjoyed his character arc because, you know, over the 2 books, because he starts out as somebody who's deeply sympathetic, because unlike Ouyang, who, you know, is completely... the places in which he is lacking social, you know, being treated as a man, he tries to just sort of excise as much of that as possible. And Wang Baoxiang is actually fairly comfortable in his gender presentation for the first book, but his grief and self-loathing in the second book from, you know, eventually selling out his brother, it turns all of this stuff into... it is no longer, even though he's still sort of secure in being a straight man who's very swishy, but it's no longer bringing him, you know, any like gender joy, because
no, you know, part of the thing where he has been like, okay, I will accept the you know, the contempt and hatred that you've shown toward me and turn it into a weapon against you, is that it renders him unable to enjoy being himself.
Right, exactly.
He lets the poison in to such an extent that it hollows him out completely. He's, I think, my favorite character in this book.
I know. I really like him as a character.
Yes.
And I think that he really has a good, like, grand tragic, you know, 2-book arc of being extremely sympathetic and then not being, and you can watch, and each decision he's making is a rational one up until, you know, by the time he's set up his boss to die horribly, at that point it stops being rational and you go, wait a minute, couldn't you just stayed home?
Yeah, no, but like every individual step on that path makes sense.
Right? Exactly.
It's really well done. It's like, you know, you can see the sort of the tragedy building up inside him, and like, you know, you can see that he knows that what he's going to do, and he doesn't like it, but he's going to do it, and it just keeps going until he realizes that it was all for nothing.
Right. This includes you know, and also there's such like great lost potential, because much like you see, you get the sense of, Ouyang could have been a different person if he'd been given, like, if any of his emotional needs had been met. And, you know, if he'd had like a bro who really truly treated him as a bro. And with Wang, you get this brief glimpse of an alternate life he could have led, where, you know, he gets mentored by the Minister for Revenue and becomes the next Minister of Revenue, and, you know, is able to like lead his extremely, you know, lead his extremely like classic genteel scholar, you know, scholar, poet, painter, aesthetic life, and be very successful.
And he could have kept his relationship with the third prince going, and, you know, presuming that the third prince eventually ascended to the throne, which it looks like he was going to, because there were no other options and there weren't going to be, he could be the court favorite, and he would actually have been able to run the empire like in a competent way.
Right. Or he could have just, you know, he could have left home early, gotten this, you know, ministry position like before the first book started, and been taken under the minister's wing, because, you know, it's clear that his boss, you know, really, you know, sees himself in Wang Baoxiang. And, you know, it basically, if he hadn't let himself get sucked into these expectations of Mongol masculinity, and he'd done the like traditional Chinese scholar masculinity, which he excels at, he could have avoided all of this and just been a happy civil servant with, like, you know, a wife and maybe a concubine, and gone to like moon viewing painting parties with the other Chinese people in the civil service, or extremely assimilated Mongols in the civil service, and just like led a happy life. And he sees that potential, but by the time he sees it, it's kind of already too late because he's already made some major powerful enemies. And so the things he has to do to keep himself safe, like pretend to be gay and seduce the third prince, really, it's at that point, it really is too late for him to pull out of that arc.
It's so beautiful. Like and like, if you want to talk about, sort of tragedy with a capital T, like the Greek tragic,
right?
Here's Wang. If you view Wang Baoxiang as the hero or as the protagonist of the story, it's really.
And I think he is. I think he is he who drowned the world in a way. I mean.
Oh, he's certainly the protagonist of this book.
Right. Exactly. Yes. Not of the duology, but of this book.
Right. And it's such a beautiful, like, classical tragic arc, and because and his tragic flaw is, if he was just as comfortable with himself as he pretended to be, none of this would have happened. Like, if he hadn't been doing it out of resentment, and had just been doing it because he liked to do it, he would have been, as you say, probably would have lived a happy and successful life.
I honestly don't even think that it's about being comfortable with himself. I think in the end, it's the same thing that we see with Ouyang, is he needed validation. And he couldn't get that validation from his father, and he couldn't really get it from his brother. And, and it didn't, and he was trying so hard to get validation from them that it never occurred to him to get it from anyone else. And part of the tragedy is that when it is too late, he realizes he could have gotten it from someone else. But at this point, that someone else, he's already, backstabbed that someone else, and that someone else is going to die horribly.
And is not even going to blame him for it.
And is not even going to blame him for it.
Which is the saddest thing, like, it's a lot. It made me think about incels.
Yeah.
I mean,
because he's not real. I mean, Ouyang in some ways is more like an incel. But both.
Well, I mean, that's a very literal interpretation of incel. Right?
Yep. Ouyang is in fact. Well, no, because Ouyang could totally have had sex with his best friend at any point. His best friend was absolutely down for it. But yes, eunuchs, the original incels.
Eunuchs always feel this way. Mongols always think you're gay. That's for any fans of the 2000s Portland, Oregon indie band Boy Eats Drum Machine.
But you're right. In both of these cases, it's people who need validation, who, because they're not getting validation for what they think is the right kind of masculinity, are being driven to. But the thing is that Wang Baoxiang doesn't get driven to misogyny.
That is true. Yes, that is absolutely
that's
true.
Kind of honestly like the thing that saves him. I mean, I mixed feelings about the ending, but like to the extent that anything saves him, the fact that he's able to still form emotion, like be polite to women and be nice to them and respect them. Is both what makes him emperor, like what gets him to emperor, and then also what saves his life in the end.
Indeed. Yeah, no, you definitely see the sort of the distinction there between the two of them.
Right, because Ouyang has this chance at redemption and passes it up because he just can't get redemption from the hands of a woman or somebody he sees as a woman. And Wang Baoxiang is totally open to getting redemption at the hands of a woman. So
let's head off to let's talk about the ending then.
Yes.
And, but in order to talk about the ending, I first want to talk about Ma Qiuying.
Yes.
Because, I mean, this is a book that's extremely preoccupied with masculinity and problematizing masculinity, different forms of masculinity, like the Mongol versus the Chinese ideals and all of this. But the women in this book, and there aren't many of them, are either, first of all, are either like people who are, playing pieces who are horribly tortured and destroyed, usually by other women.
To be fair, most of the men are also playing pieces who are horribly tortured and destroyed.
So we've already established that it's not a good life to be a civilian in this universe.
or a
You're
soldier.
not, and the book doesn't care about you at this point.
Honestly, nobody in these books ends up being happy. So
no, but our sort of actual characters here are Madame Zhang, who is, for whom her femaleness rather than her femininity is a curse, and who is using, the classic, the way to power through femininity, which is manipulating and undermining men. And the mother of the third prince, who is doing the same thing. And you have Ma. And Ma is the empathetic superhero, right?
yes.
Ma is doing the sort of Madoka Jesus on the cross thing, where it's like, I see the good in everybody, and I feel everybody's pain, and even you horrible brute of a killer without a conscience monster. I see the best in you, and I'm going to fuck you repeatedly in order to, try to get some light out of this darkness, and I'm actually going to grow to like you.
Yes, even though
I'm a lesbian.
Even though she's absolutely lesbian and not enjoying that sex in the slightest.
Yeah, and since so much attention is paid to masculinity in this book, and masculinity is problematized, and and the flaws in it and the different ideals of it are so hard, it's very strange to see this thing in Ma just presented really straightforwardly and without even looking under the surface at all.
So here's my pitch for Ma's story being a little more complicated than you're giving it credit for.
Okay.
So first of all, I will note Ma is not a paragon of Chinese female masculinity. She's I think she's Simu, but she's a non-Han ethnicity.
Okay.
And she doesn't have
Did you
bound
say female masculinity?
Femininity. Sorry, of not. But anyway, so Ma is not a paragon of Chinese femininity. She has unbound feet. She is from an aristocratic family, but she's from I can't remember if it's Hui, Chinese Muslim, or Simu, which are the Mongols. Which I'll get into the Simu thing because it's really funny when we get to.
She's meant to be Simu, I believe.
Yes, well, I will get to the Simu later when we get to Alexis gets to talk about history stuff because it's hilarious. But anyway, so she is absolutely. The fact that she is Simu makes her basically the opposite of Chinese feminine beauty.
Sure.
And so, and you see this brief clash when she's when she's pretending to be a servant and is, not when Drew is pretending to be a servant and is washing the bound feet.
Yes.
So, you get to see, and the fact that when she comes in, she's not able to come in as a Chinese concubine. She's coming in as a Korean concubine. She's not able, and part of this is the plot, but also it's a statement. She's not able to pass as the same kind of beauty that we see in Madame Zhang. So, So first of all, there's just that. So, she's got that and something else going on. But also, these two books are also about what she's willing to sacrifice, right? Because first, she decides she's going to stay married to somebody who murdered a child because she's committed to Drew's vision. And so she decides she's all in, right? Now she's going to be the Empress.
She is, by the way, far more committed to Drew's vision than Drew is, I should mention.
Yes. And then, she watches her friends get sacrificed, and she keeps doing things that make her increasingly uncomfortable and unhappy for Drew. And specifically, and she's making it clear that, she loves Drew, but she's not doing it for Drew. She's doing it for Drew's vision. And this culminates in her having, in her becoming the wife of a man when she is very much a lesbian, feels the only time she feels even the slightest bit of attraction is when he's really, being aggressively femme at her in the hopes that this will shock
disgust
her. And because she's a lesbian, those are the times when she starts to get a little bit interested. And this sufficiently confuses Wang Baoxiang that it, emotionally disarms him and allows them to form a bond. So she's acting like, oh, I see the good in everybody. But she's actually, by the time she gets there, she's become just as manipulative and just as cold-hearted as Zhu. It's just because she's not as much of a, she's not really a viewpoint character in this book particularly much, she's not like one of the focal characters. And so you don't see it, but you do watch her. But part of that is she's, she draws out of the perspective. She's sort of closing in on herself until really she's also sacrificed everything except for believing that if she can make Zhu emperor, the world will be a better place. And thus, this person who is, deeply compassionate, like bodhisattva levels of compassion here, but is totally going along with untold amounts of suffering. And so I think that, and the thing is, this redeems Wang Baoxiang, but Zhu is still emperor. And that's... Yes. I'm not convinced that this is going to be the transformative thing that she thinks it is. If there's a third book, it would be, from Ma's perspective, and it would be a tragedy.
Yes, it would be.
I only say this because we know we know that it's a duology.
Right. Like, how have you convinced me to have so many children by various men?
Right.
And why have you set up a police, like the secret police? And I thought our whole bit was like creating social mobility so people of different kinds could rise to the top of the ranks. So why have you stratified the social system even further, and so on and so on and so on?
Yes.
But there's a certain amount of Ming apologia going on here, but as you say, this is very much in keeping with the Chinese historical romance.
Anyway, I do want to dig into this, but first I want to talk about the end.
Yes. So the end, I think that it doesn't earn Zhu sparing Wang Baoxiang's life.
Yeah.
I think that Wang Baoxiang's arc, in order for it to be a good, satisfying, catharsis-ridden, classical tragedy, he should have died there. And Ma should have had to see Zhu do it, and that should have presaged what kind of empire the Ming were in fact going to be.
Yeah, exactly. Nope. It's and the thing is, I liked the book. I mean, I could argue that what this book is doing is saying, actually, a better Ming could have been possible. There is this potential for transformation in everyone, even Ming Emperor Zhu Yuanzhang. But
the entire duology up until this point has been saying the opposite of that.
Exactly. Because it's been about, you make all these sacrifices, there's a point of no return where you do enough bad things and everything that you have set in motion will inevitably end in suffering. And, Ma Xiaoying as Bodhisattva pulling this, transforming this into sparing Wang Baoxiang's life. I mean, again, very much in the tradition of the great Chinese epics, where Guan Yin just sort of comes in and is like, okay, everything's better now. But...
Speaking of high expectations for masculinity, imagine that being your expectation as a woman in
right.
society.
But I agree with you that it didn't quite feel earned. And the thing is that I really liked Wang Baoxiang as a character, and so I liked the idea that there might be some redemption for him. But I didn't feel like, and this is why I have somewhat mixed feelings about the ending. It was the sort of ending where I was like, as a critical reader, I find this highly unsatisfying, but there is kind of a nice emotional payoff there if you're invested in the characters. But I don't know.
Yeah, I found it unsatisfying on both levels because I was invested in Wang Baoxiang's character arc, and I knew that this is where it should lead him.
Right, but I kind of like the idea that, some people are denied the catharsis of their own tragic death.
That is true. It's kind of... there is something about it which, if he were capable of having feelings at this point, which I don't think he is, he would have found it immensely annoying and frustrating that he wouldn't have been killed in this.
I think he is capable of having feelings. I mean, because part of it is that every decision he has made that's led him on this path has been about, he has framed it as being about his own safety and his own life. And it's not. It's about putting him in power.
Right.
But, like everything he does to the third prince and with the third prince is he thinks that it's about his own safety. And so he makes this decision that is about his own safety, actually following through on the thing that he's been pretending the entire time. And what it does is it means that he's once again denied his grand arc.
Yeah,
but
no, there is definitely something to that. Maybe that's why I was disappointed about it. I wanted him to have his grand arc.
Right. Well, and the thing is that I feel like, and again, this is why I have mixed feelings, because I like the idea of that, and I cannot believe I'm saying this, but I think that the book would have needed to be a little bit longer. It's a little too abrupt. It doesn't quite earn that. If that's the narrative payoff, it needs to do a little bit more to build towards that, and I don't think it does.
I agree. I understand the point of ending it on the white light pouring out of the throne. Incidentally, the sound the white light makes when it pours out of the throne is Ming. But
That's
sorry.
Terrible.
That's a very old joke. You're no spring chicken yourself. I do apologize, but but yeah, I think it does end up being a little bit abrupt and unsatisfying given everything that we've done up to that point. So
yeah, and I think I think that the abrupt ending with Zhu sitting on the throne and being the name of this dynasty will be Ming would have worked if the thing that you wanted to see happened of her killing Wang Baoxiang in front of Ma Xiuying's eyes, and Ma realizing that these sacrifices were not going to be transformative in the way that she's hoping, and this setting the tone for how the Ming Dynasty does in fact turn out. That would have worked better, and then at that point the abrupt end would have worked, but.
There's a line earlier, just earlier, where the narration itself says that Ma has been chosen by fate to be the person who bears witness to the suffering.
Right.
And thereby making it real,
yes.
and meaningful. And I feel like, maybe Ma saving his life is her, rejecting her fate the same way that Zhu rejected his fate. But again, it's it pulls its punches either way. Either it isn't willing to sell you on what denying Wang Baoxiang and Ma Xiuying both of their fates, what that means, and it's also not willing to carry the narrative through where it's supposed to be going, I think. So a little bit disappointing. I still think that there's some interesting threads there. So I, did not dismiss it out of hand. Indeed. Okay.
Okay, now can I talk about the Ming Dynasty a little bit?
Yes.
Okay.
Before you do that, let me just do random notes.
Yes.
So that we can end on the history.
Okay. So the people who do not want to hear me talk about history can just stop listening.
That's not what I meant. I just want to get the last ones out of the way. I think note number one, this book helped me understand why in our world dictators tend to be friendly with each other. Because it really, Wang Baoxiang really you really get a sense of how lonely he is at the top when he can't trust anybody. And it's there are very few people who will be able to relate, and being validated, as you say, is sort of the core of this. And it's okay, so when I think about the way that, Trump and various other people are, or sort of seem to be able to be collegial with each other in a way that they're not with democratic leaders, I think of that. But and my other random thought is that I think this would make a great tactics game. We need new FF tactics. I think this would be great as a tactics game. This whole duology.
Yeah, I mean, Water Merchant and Romance of the Three Kingdoms both have have tactics games, so I don't see why not. I would absolutely, yes. So clearly, somebody should pay Shelley Parker Chan a fair amount of money to license tactics game. I would absolutely play the heck out of that.
Yes. And third and final note, I know the book thinks that like the reason that Ju is able to overcome her sort of physical and social, limitations and continue to pursue her ambition is because of her, sort of actually like sort of eternal optimism almost. But I think it may just because she gets hit on the head so many times. I think that she may be so concussed that she is incapable of,
she definitely seems a little less intelligent in this book, and maybe that's just because we spend less time inside her head.
She gets knocked out a lot.
Yeah,
and that might contribute to a number of different things, but okay. But I'm done now. Let's get on to the history.
Okay,
it's history time with Alexis. How much did these people suck?
So I was talking about Ma as as it being incapable of being the paragon of Chinese femininity, and this is because in the Ming legal code, which was written by or under Zhu Yuanzhang, there is a forced miscegenation, for lack of a better word, law, so that any Mongol or other non-Han minority inside the Ming are not allowed to marry within their own ethnic group. They have to outmarry. This is like there's a really interesting form of genocide that we don't, I can't think of another model. I'm sure there is one, but like I haven't seen a similar version of this, which, but there's forced out marriage.
It's not dissimilar to like Indian schools and forced adoption.
Yes,
but
yes.
It's not exactly the
same
thing.
Right, it's not exactly the same thing because people can, because you can raise your own children in speaking, whatever language, but still, it is. But you're right, it is that kind of similar. It is adoption through a kind of, or genocide through a forced assimilation. And in this case, though, the method of forced assimilation is forced out marriage, with one exception, which are the Simu, because, says the law, the Simu are so hideously ugly that it would be unfair to force them to marry other people because nobody else would ever marry them. And, you can't force an entire people to be forever celibate. So the Simu are allowed to continue to in-marry.
Yes, I remember when I was reading up on the history, I saw that.
And it's like Ma Xiuying. So the historical Ma Xiuying was Han, I believe. She was definitely not Simu.
Yeah.
And there's an interesting, and so this is where, by and large, I have no problem playing fast and loose with history. One of these days, we will do a bonus episode on Iron Widow, which does even more so. But, but I actually feel like this was another slight flinch away, because one of the things that makes Zhu Yuanzhang, the actual historical first emperor, what he was, is just that he was overwhelmingly Han supremacist, anti-Mongol racist. I mean, he has some reason for being anti-Mongol. The Mongols were, the oppressive, somewhat falling apart dynasty that he overthrew.
Yes.
But, he was known for being just real racist towards all the non-Han ethnicities. So, first of all, the fact that in this one he's marrying a Simu woman, making his historical wife Simu, would make the historical Zhu Yuanzhang furious. But also, it brings me. This is the same thing I said about the first book, which I find it really interesting that you can have a book where somebody is so ambitious and single-minded, and they are willing to make war crimes and child murder, and still empathetic characters, but nobody is really racist. And this isn't, the thing is, you see a lot of racial stuff, but you don't, none of the characters who are supposed to really empathize with have the kind of virulent racism that was absolutely going around.
That is true because, like, our Wang Baoxian is Han, or half Han,
Right.
and Ouyang is also Han, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
And so, yeah, and as is Ju. So, like, every character who we were meant to empathize with,
Except for
is
Ma,
Han,
except for Ma Xiaoying, who is historically
who is the paragon of empathy and virtue, and would never,
right,
But yeah,
and
no.
is basically and is one of our few. I'm not occupies an ethnic minority. So
But yeah, no, it's really, despite all the stuff about the differences in masculinities between the Yuan and the Mongols, I mean, and the Han, it's like it really, you're right, it's not constructed as racial animus at all, even though that was very much what it actually was.
yes, I mean the Ming again forced out marriage for every non-Han ethnicity except for the Simu because they are too hideous.
Yes.
And I honestly think that this has something interesting to say about, modern society and what modern fantasy readers will put up with.
Yeah, I mean, even to the greater extent than, like, the outright, vile misogyny that Ouyang that espouses. I don't know. That is interesting, and it's also sort of it's also kind of a cheat around what's currently happening in China, with a
Great deal of genocide.
an assimilationist genocide currently being waged against the Uyghurs and several other ethnic groups. So
Yeah. It's my last thing as a historian is going to be that one of the things I think is really interesting about this book is that the ending reads totally differently based on whether or not you know anything about Ming history.
that is true, and I don't know if the average reader does, right? So,
Right.
I mean,
Right, 'cause, like,
the average English-speaking reader absolutely does not.
Right.
So-
And so honestly, actually, this is a place where your complaint against the ending, I think, is more persuasive because I read this and I go, well, you think it's going to be transformative, Ma Xiaoying. But, I know. Eventually the eunuchs are going to be running the secret police. But your average fantasy reader is not going to know that. And so this is going to be a triumphant ending with, like, this strange, giving into compassion. And that does make the ending, if you know what the Ming is going to become, then the fact that she spares Wang Baoxiang's life has bearing on Wang Baoxiang's narrative, but not on on all the pieces of her humanity that she sacrificed to get here. But if you don't know that, then you can still believe in her vision. And I think that is an interesting dichotomy.
It made me think about whether this book. It made me think about whether this book could be published in China, and whether that ending would make it more likely to be acceptable to have it published in China.
I think the ending probably would actually make it more likely, but the fact that it has fairly explicit lesbian, like the explicit lesbian sex would have to get censored for it to be published in China.
Yes. But it made me wonder if that was a consideration or not. But
I don't think
I'm
going to give
that's very much the author is
the
dead.
Author is dead, and
of,
I'm going to give the author the courtesy of assuming that this was that this was the narrative that they and their agent and their editor thought was the appropriate one, even if it's one that we're nitpicking.
Indeed.
So
because it is kind of hard to sell a 2-volume fantasy series with an untrammeledly tragic ending. So, or maybe not. I don't know.
No, I think probably. But I should actually say, disclaimer, because I'm being kind of harsh on the Ming here. I was a Qing historian, so first of all, it's not like the dynasty I studied had a leg to stand on. But second of all, much like Zhu Yuanzhang had his anti-Yuan bias, I am, the Qing historians are known for having a bit of an anti-Ming bias.
Well, I mean, clearly we should read the book about the good Chinese dynasty that was fair and just and didn't slaughter anybody.
Well, if you read some of the historical romances, no, honestly, one of the things I do like about the Chinese historical narrative tradition is that even with the possible exception of Feng Shen Yi, by and large, both sides just do a fair amount of awful stuff.
That's Investiture of the Gods, a book about the death of King Zhou, who was the last king of the Shang dynasty. He pissed off the goddess Nua, apparently, so she sent the 1,000-year-old vixen spirit, the 9-headed pheasant spirit, and the jade peepa spirit to torture him. He ends up dying because of a cabbage metaphor. Why couldn't they have made this one into a lesbian book? I would have much preferred that. Yes. But so next episode we will be getting into yet more of this, although for a more fantastic sort of approach.
We will be doing the gender swapped, at least somewhat lesbian retelling of Shui Hutran, the Water Margin. And you know what, guys? I fully support all of you rewriting both Chinese history and the great Chinese classic novels as lesbian fantasies. Keep it up. Do more of it. Thank you.
There you go. More on my view on that when we do it. I have not finished the book at this point. I do not know what my take is going to be. All right, but until then, farewell.
Bye, everyone.